Bien, bonjour. Welcome to the Victoria Forum. Soyez les bienvenus au Forum de Victoria. My name is Sébastien Beaulieu. I'm Associate Co-Chair of the Victoria Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you from Dakar, Sénégal. Soyez les bienvenus au Forum de Victoria. Je m'appelle Sébastien Beaulieu. Je suis l'ambassadeur du Canada au Sénégal et co-président associé du Forum de Victoria. Et il me fait plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette conversation réellement mondiale à partir de Dakar au Sénégal. Le Forum de Victoria, le thème de l'année, c'est combler les clivages, et le thème du jour, c'est vérité et confiance dans la science. The Victoria Forum's theme this year is about bridging divides, and today's webinar is around truth and trust in science. The Victoria Forum is an innovative and great partnership between the Senate of Canada and the University of Victoria. Le Forum de Victoria, c'est un partenariat entre le Sénat du Canada et l'Université de Victoria. Et le webinaire d'aujourd'hui est organisé en partenariat avec le Pacific Institute for Climate Studies et le Cascade Institute du Royal Roads University. Today's event is brought to you by the Pacific Institute for Climate Studies and Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University. I'm pleased to hand it over to Christy Facer from the Pacific Institute for Climate Studies, and she'll present the panel. Over to you, Christy. Thank you. Au plaisir.
Great. Thanks, Sebastian. And thank you and a warm welcome to all of you joining us for this timely and important conversation. And a special thanks to the Victoria Forum supporters, Vancity and TELUS. We are delighted to have you with us today. Today's webinar focuses on an aspect of the pandemic that has been at the center of our unfolding sense of the virus and what it means for us as a society. The state of evidence around COVID-19 and our trust in science and the institutions we depend on for it. Indeed, many have observed that the last few months have resulted in a renewed spotlight on science, as individuals and institutions alike seek out knowledge not only to understand the meaning and data behind different COVID response and management measures, but also to make daily decisions about how to conduct our lives and to protect those who have been directly affected by the virus. In this sense, the current crisis has not only shone the light on the rapidly evolving evidence base around COVID-19, but also the system and the structures involved in the production, translation, and application of this knowledge in healthcare, in public policy, and in broader society and social settings. This lived experience, and indeed experiment that we are all suddenly a part of, has also laid bare how and where these systems have prepared us, or failed to prepare us, for a risk that we had been warned about. It also raises questions about the tensions and paradoxes inherent in the mores of science and the scientific establishment, as it were, and the changing relationship society has with expertise, news, and trusted sources of information. These issues are relevant not only to the fight against urgent crises like COVID-19, but also those with longer time horizons, such as the threat of biodiversity collapse, or an issue we hope to talk about today, climate change. For those of us that work with experts and the application of expertise in research to wicked problems, like at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, where I work, or the Cascade Institute, where my fellow co-convener and the final speaker today, Thomas Homer Dixon, comes from, there are a few more crucial questions to guide what we do and how we do it. It is therefore my great pleasure to have with us today an outstanding group of leading thinkers in the fields of health, systems science, journalism, and climate finance to share their insights on the topic of trust in science. I will introduce each of them in turn and also accept questions in the chat, which I will hope to respond to in the Q&A at the end of this session. So without further ado, I'd like to begin our discussion today by welcoming Diane T. Finegood, professor and fellow of the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue at the Simon Fraser University. Diane, at Simon Fraser, Diane teaches a semester in Wicked Problems as part of the cohort program there. And although starting out her career as an engineer, she's also continued on to span a broad range of disciplines and leadership roles throughout, including the past president and CEO of the Michael Smith Foundation, as scientific director of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and currently as the executive director of the Canadian Health Services and Policy Research Alliance. Diane is also an internationally recognized researcher known for her work, among others, in diabetes, health modeling, cross-sector partnerships, and complex adaptive systems. She has won numerous awards, attracted over 35 million in grant funding for her work, and published more than 140 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters. Thank you so much, Diane, and welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation to participate today. I'm really quite excited. I actually want to begin by acknowledging that I'm an uninvited settler on the unceded traditional territory of many Coast Salish people. And I also want to acknowledge at this moment in time the common colonial roots of other forms of racism, including anti-Black and anti-Asian racism. It's a time for us all to be learning. So I have three key messages today, and hopefully I can get through the sort of arguments there in a timely fashion. The three messages are: the pandemic is complex, not just complicated, and I'll spend a little bit of time trying to explain the distinction between them. I'd also like to make the point that our research data and evidence generating systems, the mechanics of how we fund and support research, incentivize research, they're mostly built for complicated problems, and we really need them to be recognizing the complexity of COVID-19. And my last comments will be about Bonnie Henry, because I think she's a leader who seems to understand the difference between complex and complicated, and it probably would help if more of us did as well. So starting with the pandemic is complex and not just complicated. And really, in reality, it's both in different ways and different times, and that's important to recognize. But complicated problems are predictable, controllable, and designable. So when you've got a problem where you can make predictions that help you understand the future, where you can create control mechanisms and design for the outcome that you want, your problem's complicated. And it's important because the kind of science that we do, the science that we build around this, breaks down the problem into its component parts, isolates interactions, looks for causes and effects, and assumes that the solution is going to be in the cause. These are supported well by managerial and top-down approaches. Complex problems, on the other hand, are unpredictable, self-organizing, and emergent. So clearly COVID-19 has a huge element of unpredictability to it because it's a brand new pandemic and a brand new virus, and we really are learning as we go. And I think some of the opening remarks we'll hear later about how we're coming to grips with the fact that we don't know all the answers at the beginning is probably a good thing, actually, learning that in complexity, other approaches are needed. We need more integrative approaches. We need to focus on relationships and interdependencies and heterogeneity. And I'll make some comments about that later. So, when case counts are low, you can do a track and trace kind of approach, and that's very mechanical and kind of complicated. But when case counts in a particular jurisdiction go up and they're much higher, then community transmission becomes higher, and the situation becomes much more complex, and everybody needs to be engaged in the solutions. And if anything, it can become chaotic, where you go from order to disorder. And I think we're seeing that play out in many jurisdictions south of the border. So what's important here is that when we start thinking about solutions, we need to think that we need rules-based solutions work fine when a problem is complicated. So that's great. You can set rules, wear masks, don't wear masks, those sorts of things. If the problem was really quite just complicated and predictable, et cetera. And you can see elements of that in the issue around masks, for example. But when rules fail, they fail when there's a very heterogeneous community of people that you're working with. And there's nothing, our population is heterogeneous. And we really need to recognize that people have to act as well and use their own understanding of their context and their situation to address issues. So that's when you need to go to a more principles-based approach. And I think that's what we're seeing here in BC. Now, so that's to make the argument it's complex, not just complicated. Our research data and evidence systems, as I said earlier, and even our governance systems are well designed for complicated, not so good for complex, because we are used to that notion that you got to work out the causes of the problem to know the solutions, and that's not always the case. And if you do it that way, when the problem is complex and there's hundreds of issues, you come up with 100 different solutions which you can't actually manage and do together. We need to support, and our systems for evidence, research, and data tend to support that kind of top-down cause-based science. And what we need here in COVID-19 is more agile science. We need more co-production, transdisciplinary work. We need to focus on the solutions regardless of the causes. And that's harder to get funded in this day and age. And certainly we need to continue to try to push in that direction. We're seeing signs of it as a result of COVID-19. For the first time, there's a national collaborative network called Can COVID. I heard a fascinating story about an emergency medicine doc yesterday who has pulled together in a very collaborative fashion a group of emergency departments to create a registry for COVID-19 patients. And that'll be critical data, I suspect, as we go forward, thinking about how do we care for and what are the best solutions for our sickest people who end up in emergency. So we really need to shift from that problem-based to solution-based integrated approach. And I'll just make a quick comment that problem-based approaches don't work all that well, as sort of articulated earlier. Things like obesity and chronic disease don't, we know a lot about the causes, but we're quibbling about it. I'm not an expert in climate change, but I'd argue that the same thing is probably true in climate change. We've been quibbling over, or it was for a very long time, quibbling over the causes of the problem and not focusing on appropriate solutions under the circumstances. And even in things like long-term care, which I think we're all aghast at, we've known the problems in that sector for a very long time, but the hierarchy and silos of governance have made it very difficult to address the actual key challenges. So I'll move towards the end of my remarks here by speaking about Bonnie Henry, who's become my hero, of course, as she has many others. And for those who might be outside of British Columbia, she's the public health official who the New York Times chose to write about. And the comment I want to make is my impression of Bonnie Henry is she really understands the difference between complex and complicated. She understands it, and it would be great if more of us did. So I'll make the comments. The common response to complex problems are despair, retreat, believing the problem is beyond hope. But sometimes we galvanize our collective effort, and I see her trying hard to do that, to shift the way we think about it being somebody else's responsibility to being all of our responsibility. In systems approaches, you can't make it happen, you can't let it happen, but you can help it happen. And that's what I see her trying to do. And she's trying to put forward those principles that I was talking about a little bit earlier with really simple messaging, like always reiterating, be kind, be calm, be safe. That's our guiding light in British Columbia. And those are principles, not no, you can't wear, no, you have to wear a mask in this space, and this space. And there's lots of interesting pros and cons and tensions between those approaches, but she's tried very hard to keep her self-focused on solutions appropriate in complexity. She recognizes we don't all have the same capacity to deal with the challenges that we're faced with, so she finds that important balance between top-down and help it happen kinds of approaches. And she also understands that in a high-trust environment, it's less complex for us to act. So if we trust our leaders who are helping guide us through a collective approach, then it's a little bit easier for each of us to kind of go there. So I will end my remarks there, and I hope that you're coming back, Christy, means I'm right on time.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. I really like what you said about a solutions focus and the importance of co-production in achieving that, and really in unlocking some of those fixed positions that we have that maybe lead to some of these wicked problems and our inability to really make change in the face of them. So without going further, I would like to now shift over to our next speaker and welcome Mark Campanale, who is the founder of the Carbon Tracker Initiative and co-founder of Planet Tracker, two nonprofit organizations, and he's also worked extensively in helping the world to understand the unburnable carbon capital markets thesis, which he will talk a little bit about today. Mark has 30 years experience in sustainable financial markets, has been recognized as one of the most influential people in London, and has played important roles in guiding the work of global organizations such as the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, the UK Sustainable and Responsible Investment Forum, the Rainforest Foundation in the UK, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and many others. Mark, welcome, and thank you again for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Christy, for that very generous introduction. So what I'm going to talk about today is data and the data we choose or not choose to help inform and make policy decisions that have profound consequences for the rest of the world. And the one I'm going to pick on today, I'm going to talk about climate change. And those who are familiar with the Paris climate agreement that was signed will know that in it, nowhere is mentioned the words fossil fuels. So it's a treaty about emissions reductions. It's about getting the world to reduce its use of energy intensive products. But it doesn't really talk about what we need to do in terms of constraining the growth of fossil fuels. So my presentation is to look at the data from a different angle, which is from the supply angle instead of the demand angle, and to see what we can learn. And what I'm going to look at is the science around carbon budgets and the available fossil fuels and how that links to carbon budgets. And I'm going to talk about what corporations are doing around the world and their investors. And then lastly, I'm going to conclude about how technology is fundamentally changing the outlook, but leaving the question, great that technology is arriving, but are we moving fast enough? So I think most of you will be familiar with the basics really here. Then in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen an explosive growth in the use of fossil fuels from industrialization, particularly in Southeast Asia, but around the rest of the world too. And it's these emissions from the burning of fossil fuels that is of most concern to the scientists, because it's the link really between the burning of fossil fuels and atmospheric carbon dioxide. And when we burn principally coal, but also oil and gas, carbon dioxide will sit in the atmosphere for some 200 years. And the oceans we know have been absorbing the carbon, but in all other respects, we're really racing ahead. So we've got the highest concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, certainly for 500,000 years, possibly for more than 2 or 3 million years. And when we ask how quickly did we do that, we've literally done that in a blink of an eye from the planet's point of view in just around 50 years. So we call this the understanding around this, we call this the carbon budget. We can link how much carbon dioxide can be released into the atmosphere, which is somewhere around between, depending on who you are, somewhere between 300 and 900 gigatons of CO2 is what we've got left. And what you're looking at here, I want to take those of you who can see this, I want you to take to look at the horizontal lines along the bottom, which run down. And the lower lines are the remaining carbon budget to 1.5 degrees. And you can see that declines. And then the higher bar is the remaining carbon budget to 2 degrees with different levels of probability. And then those vertical bars that you're looking at, the red is the coal Then you've got the gas in the dark blue, and then the lighter blue, you've got the oil. And what you can see from that is that we know that there's 7 times more proven reserves of fossil fuels than we can possibly burn as to stay below 2 degrees. And as that carbon budget declines, we'll go through 1.5 degrees in around 13 years' time. That means that we'll release to the atmosphere concentrations of CO2 that will lead to that warming outcome. And then certainly within the next 30 years, 2 degrees and then 3 degrees of warming, which again, the planet's not seen for certainly millions of years. So this is all on our watch. And we need to grapple really of understanding how this data feeds into the climate negotiations. And the point really I'm making is that the data does not fit in to the world's climate negotiations, because of course we don't talk about fossil fuels, we don't talk about carbon budgets in the Paris Climate Agreement. And so we don't really have a way of looking at how the supply of fossil fuels really leads to the outcome, which is a secure, climate secure energy system. So these are the rapid pathways that we need to get to for a decline to a secure net zero carbon by around 2050. And yet when we look at the plans of the fossil fuel industry, up until literally the last week, you'll see all of the fossil fuel majors are forecasting a rapid increase in the supply and also the demand for fossil fuels. And it was only a couple of years ago that OPEC was forecasting a 50% increase in demand for oil and gas in coming years. Now, I said up until this week, so those who follow the news will have seen that BP has really cut itself away from the pack and are planning to cut production by 40%. Very dramatic kind of switch. But all the other majors, and even within Canada, you've got these forecasts of increased use of fossil fuels to justify the building of pipelines and the continued expansion of the Canadian oil sands. So that doesn't really link to the science. And we have a carbon tracker, a fear that what this will do is lead to stranded assets, what we call reserves that will have to remain in the ground. And in that, we really have to challenge the thinking of that other group of fantastic data scientists or analysts, which is the financial community. Their analysis, particularly amongst the banks and the investors supporting the expansion, and I'm just going to leave you with a figure. We're currently spending around $1 trillion a year expanding the fossil fuel economy. And that's not going down by much. And we have this concern that a lot of the assets being built, the coal mines, the pipelines, the oil rigs, will be unneeded in coming years for a very simple reason, a change in technology. So there's about 30 of us at Carbon Tracker. We model all of these different company plans, and we can find out which particular projects, and there's some of there on the screen, 2 of them are LNG projects in Canada, are simply not needed as we move towards these lower temperature outcomes of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And there you've got the Canadian oil sands in there as well. And there we have a concern that really the banking system is supporting a technology which really has had its day. I mentioned technology. And what this slide is trying to show you is it's a very rapid declines in the costs of production of 3 key technologies: wind turbines, solar PV, and lithium-ion batteries, which we call this the learning curve, the rate at which, through increased use, prices drop for the cost of production. So today, in most parts of the world, renewables without subsidy are cheaper than traditional fossil fuels. So we've got this technology cutting right in to these demand forecasts, which is where we believe that financial market regulators who look at the data, and we're looking at the data when we had the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, has to pick up on this and think of new and smarter ways of intervening. Because what we know from markets is that markets, financial markets, where our pension funds are invested in our savings, don't wait till the use or the volume of fossil fuels declines before prices change. And my last slide, and I'll leave you with this, is Carbon Tracker. We were launched in 2011 to educate and provide analysis and data to regulators and pension funds about what's happening. And the share price performance of fossil fuels, which is represented by the coal index by the black line along the bottom, oil services by that bluish line, and power utilities by the reddish line, have now really underperformed the rest of the stock market, the S&P 500 being a good representative sample of that. And I think what's happening is markets don't believe the plans of the fossil fuel majors either. So today we're seeing a clean energy transition, and COVID, if anything, has brought forward peak demand for the use of fossil fuels, and that actually the rise of clean technologies and companies like Tesla now being worth more than many of the oil companies, showing how rapidly change can happen. And the challenge we face now is to how can we feed in the technology change, the need to constrain financing of fossil fuels into international agreements that can get us the kind of climate secure outcome that all of us, I think, listening today would want. Thank you very much, Christy.
Super. Thank you, Mark. And I think some of the themes that you talked about in terms of the ability to respond to rapid changes in our environment, and also, you know, new communities that are very important to the decisions that we make, like investors and corporations, are key not only to the climate crisis, but also in terms of, you know, for instance, vaccines and how we deal with COVID-19. Our next speaker, I'm pleased to present, is Ivan Semenuk, science writer for the Globe and Mail. Ivan Semenuk reports on science for the Globe and Mail and is a longtime science journalist in print, online, and broadcast media. His stories have informed Canadians about topics as diverse as space exploration, genetic engineering, and climate change. His previous roles include Washington-based chief correspondent for the journal Nature and the US bureau chief for New Scientist magazine. He has been a producer with the Discovery Channel in Canada, and his work has garnered several awards, including the Royal Canadian Institute's Sanford Fleming Medal for contributions to the public understanding of science, a very important element of what we're dealing with today. So welcome, Ivan, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Christy. It's really great to be here with everyone today. I'm happy to be part of the conversation. As usual, as a journalist, I'm going to feel a little bit of an outsider in the conversation. I think that's the way it should be. You know, I'm speaking here not as a researcher, but I guess a practitioner working at the interface of science and I guess what we would call public affairs or the public space. And so I'll start. I'm also going to lay out a few points, and then hopefully that will weave in with some of what we've already heard and areas in which there's more successful or less successful uptake for data and trust in science. One observation I'll make, it's just even listening to my career track as you were speaking, is just reflecting on how public impressions of science have shifted in subtle ways over the time that I've worked at various media outlets. One thing that's interesting, it was a transition that happened so quietly. I don't think people remark on it very much, but these days we tend to use, in this type of conversation, science and evidence almost interchangeably. We talk about evidence-based decision making. That's something that wasn't happening 15, 20 years ago. There are good reasons for using the word evidence when we're talking about data and why science matters. There is an interesting, though, perhaps unintended consequence of it, which is that it reinforces a particular metaphor that I've run into when I'm talking to people who are not scientists about their perception of science. I would call it the courtroom metaphor, because when we're thinking about evidence, where we're usually introduced to that word is evidence is something that people bring to court. Evidence is presented, assessed, and then, in sort of the cliche version of the courtroom drama, the jury leaves the room, they argue, and then they come back and they render a verdict. And I think for some people that is a sense of how science works, that it provides answers that we then act on to make policy decisions. Scientists would, of course, say that's not exactly how it is. In fact, the courtroom metaphor doesn't quite apply unless you imagine a courtroom where the jury never leaves the room, where new evidence is constantly coming on board, being presented, being weighed. The accumulation of evidence kind of leads in different directions. Most of the time, that doesn't change anything, at least over the span of months or years. We've seen an interesting counterexample just in the last few months with COVID-19, where there's tremendous expertise that's been brought to bear on the pandemic, but a paucity of data. So you've got lots of amazing experts unable to be entirely sure about whether we should wear masks, or whether this type of transmission is worse than this type of transmission, or which behavior we should employ that will be safest, simply because the data haven't yet come in that would tell us that. So it really reveals how in real time our understanding of what's going on in the world is evolving and changing as the evidence comes in. I think scientists are comfortable with that. Where it becomes difficult for the public, or difficult for journalists trying to present what scientists are saying, is that if the expectation is that there's a decision, or that perhaps sometimes things are presented as settled, or this is no longer an argument, then and then later when we find out, well, here's something that's perhaps a contradictory evidence that works against public expectation of what science is doing, and perhaps that inadvertently can erode public trust in science. So it's something that we should be cautious of. I just want to point out that metaphor is out there. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when we think of when I observe how scientists and others think my work proceeds, or what is challenging about my work, usually the perception is that it's a job of translation, or kind of engagement, trying to get people interested in science, or trying to figure out how to explain complicated things, which experts are talking about. Certainly, there's room for technical achievement in doing those things well. It is an important part of the job. But the real trick in science journalism, or for people who are working in that interface, is really choosing, when is the evidence and why is the evidence sufficient to elevate certain ways of thinking about the world. Because, like it or not, when a journalist decides to cover something, they are drawing attention to a worldview, and trying to kind of marshal the evidence around why that worldview exists, and what it has, how that can inform the public. But it's a tricky choice, and it's a challenge that's compounded in a sense, because scientists, like, the process of science is a process that's somewhat adversarial. Scientists challenge each other. They're critical thinkers. They're skeptical. They're cautious about what the data are saying, and about not going too far with the data. But by the time we get to kind of distilling the messages of science to the public, there's a sense that what the aim is to build trust in science, and to try to distill that down to a simple message, perhaps, or a straightforward message. And often the public are asking for that. Should I wear a mask? Should I not wear a mask? This is a key, important question. But the process of science behind that can be full of uncertainty and ambiguity. So again, that's partly a reflection of the way things are. But when expectations aren't met, or when scientists appear to be saying or acting in a way that doesn't fit with the metaphors that people have about something that is decisive, or that's rendering decisions, then people walk away perhaps with less trust, or less understanding about what scientists are trying to do. So those are some of the pitfalls that come about from maybe oversimplifying what the task is in trying to express complexity and an evolving data-driven environment in the public space. The last thing I want to say is, just as by way of introduction, is that obviously I'm going to argue in favor of an important role for science journalists in communicating science to the public. Perhaps that's self-serving, but I think it's important to stress why, because even among scientists, there's a sense that scientists should be in the public space, and often scientists feel they're the best placed to speak to the public about directly about what they're finding and what they're learning. I definitely endorse the idea of scientists speaking in the public space, but it's also important to have journalists working in that space because of the unique role that journalists play as independent reporters of the affairs of the world, and independent reporters in the public interest. We're in a place now where the media space, the broad media space, not just journalism, but everything we see, social media, you name it, everything, is vast, and the amount of information is impossible to encompass for one person. It's just a huge flood of information every day. Journalism is a very tiny part of it. What makes it a bit different, though, is this focus on independence and the public interest. Certainly, a lot of scientists would say they're working in the public interest, but by definition, they're not independent of the work they do. And then, meanwhile, we have a lot of other forms of science communication that are happening for other reasons, entertainment, education, promotion, and so on. So there is a place for journalists here. There's a perception that the big challenge in that role are some of the traditional challenges of explaining complicated things, or avoiding false balance when talking about climate change, or not overhyping or oversimplifying things. All of those challenges are there, but by far the bigger one, I think, now for journalists is to simply that challenge of being labeled as untrustworthy. Fake news, and kind of being called out as taking a side. And there are lots of reasons why those labels appear, and why critics are quick to try to identify a certain piece of journalism. This is something that to their followers, this is something you shouldn't be paying attention to. So that's the kind of the stream that journalists are swimming against, as trying to be independent presenters of what's known. And I'm just going to end on a sense of optimism that despite the wild west of the social media that we see right now, and the fact that so much information is able to, and kind of anti-science sentiment is able to circulate in different fora, I'll just stress how early in the game we are in the online media ecosystem. If we think about the early days of the printing press, what broadsheets and newspapers were like in previous centuries, and kind of unregulated and wild information that was circulated when the printing press became common. There are a lot of things now that would not meet the standards of responsible journalism. The kind of journalism that I was trained to do really gelled in the 20th century, and we're trying to apply those principles in the 21st century in a new environment that is, again, a bit of a wild west, but I think there are incentives and forces that will help to regulate that. So there's reason to be optimistic, even as we sort of try to sort through all the noise. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, but hopefully that will fit in with what others have to say.
Thank you, Ivan. I actually wrote down ecosystem as you were speaking earlier, and I think what you said and your experiences as a journalist really help us to understand not just the people who are making the science, but also those that we depend on to kind of understand it and communicate it to us, and what the pitfalls are around that. And I think that the point of optimism and helping us understand how this courtroom analogy can put sense around the uncertainty that we're currently dealing with is really valuable. So thank you. And I think this now has really set the stage for our final speaker, Thomas Homer Dixon, my colleague and co-convener for this session and for the environmental divide of the Victoria Forum. Thomas holds a university research chair in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He's also the director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University in Victoria. Between 2009 and 2014, he was the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. He's born in Victoria, BC, and received his BA in Political Science from Carleton University, and his PhD from MIT in International Relations, Defense, and Arms Control Policy and Conflict Theory. Thomas has also written a number of books, including The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization, and has another one coming up this fall. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Scientific American, and other major media outlets. His current research is focused on threats to global security in the 21st century, including economic instability, climate change, energy scarcity, and how people, organizations, and societies can better resolve conflicts and innovate to complex problems, especially environmental ones. So welcome, Thomas, and over to you.
Thank you, Christy. Well, it's marvelous to join this conversation today, and I want to thank Christy very much. I am nominally the co-convener of this process, but Christy has really led the way and done an absolutely splendid job of bringing this conversation together. I thought today that I would focus on a few issues relating to the nature of science, because we've been using the concept of science a lot in our conversation. But we need to consider really what it is and why, in some respects, it's in trouble. So my remarks will amplify and extend some of the very helpful comments that the other panelists have made today, and then perhaps lead us towards a conversation about what the solutions might be or how we might address some of these challenges relating to trust in science. So I think one of the first points I want to make is to raise the question about what we call the epistemic status of science. What gives scientists and science the right to claim that science is a privileged way of accessing truth about reality? There are obviously many, many different ways of knowing the world, but there's this sense, at least to some among many people who admire the scientific process, that the scientific way of knowing the world is a better one. It gets us closer to something that we might regard as truth. It gives us more access to predictive control, the ability to predict the events in the future and understand where the world might be going, and perhaps even control our direction into that future. What science is actually the subject of enormous conversation within philosophy and science technology studies and universities. I think though we can simply say that it is an institutionalized way of ensuring that evidence from reality bears on our hypotheses about the nature of that reality, our propositions about the nature of that reality. Basically, science is a way of ensuring that evidence has some grip, as I say, on our hypotheses. It helps us shift the balance of perceived probability of whether our statements about reality are right or wrong. As we gather more evidence, we learn more about, we shift our estimate as to whether a particular theory about reality, hypothesis is right or wrong. And that process is institutionalized in science, and we can see it work. We can see the judgments unfold, and it's formalized. So we have ways of correcting the process if the evidence isn't effectively applied to render judgments about hypotheses. So I think this relates very much to Ivan's point about the courtroom metaphor. Courtrooms make a decision. There's kind of a final statement as to what the evidence says. But in science, as Ivan pointed out, it's an ongoing process of constantly weighing evidence, of bringing that evidence to bear on our view of reality. And the jury, in some sense, as Ivan said, never leaves the room. And I think it's a common misunderstanding of science that this is an ongoing process and a consensus process of balancing the evidence and arriving at a judgment. So with that as our sort of background understanding of what science is, does it work as effectively as it may have in the past in our new world with problems like climate change and COVID and biodiversity collapse and the challenges that Christy mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today. And I think Diane made these points really wonderfully, that our world has in many respects become more complex, and many of the systems we're dealing with, economic, social, health systems, ecological systems, are not complicated and can't be understood by breaking them apart in a reductionist way and understanding their internal workings as individual parts, but instead have to be seen as a whole and as systems, integrated systems, and they're not so. The metaphor of machines doesn't work as effectively as it did in the past, whether we're talking about our economies or whether we're talking about ecosystems through the climate or world health systems that relate to the pandemic. And I think you can make a strong argument that the complexity of the world, of our world, because of the larger human population, increased connectivity within that human population, increased throughput of energy and information and materials through the links between the elements of the human population, that basically the human socio-ecological systems are vastly more complex than they used to be, say, just a few decades ago. And that renders them more nonlinear, more likely to flip from one state to another in their behavior, as we've seen recently with the pandemic. It also makes it harder, much harder for us, even with a disciplined process like science, to discern the internal workings of these systems and to identify underlying causal processes and fundamental causes. Evidence in a complex system can be selected in many ways to support a wide range of judgments about the nature of underlying causes. And it also means in a complex system that our ability to control and predict these systems declines because we can't really understand exactly, as well as we might with a merely complicated system, exactly what's going on inside, and therefore control the system effectively. So I think that's one reason that science faces profound challenges in our world today, the rising complexity of many of the systems we're dealing with. I think Diane made that point very well. But I think Mark raised another issue, which is that fundamentally a lot of our scientific findings nowadays are challenging some very profound economic vested interests in our societies. For instance, fossil fuel vested interests, fossil fuel companies around the world, and a lot of people who have those economic commitments, who have jobs or investments in those industries, and we all do one way or the other through things like pension funds, don't want to believe that science because it's enormously threatening to their view of the world and their future well-being if it turns out that climate science is right. And so there's this disincentive to accept the findings of science. So I think these two things, the challenge of science to some of our deep vested interests and worldviews, and also the challenge of complexity to the judgment process, the scientific judgment process, have meant that there is a really profound crisis for science in our democratic conversations in our societies now. So I think this in turn leads to overall much higher levels of uncertainty. That people feel that they don't really understand what's going on in the world, that the leaders who were supposed to take care of them, the technocratic elites that were supposed to take care of them are no longer able to tell them what's going on and protect them from threatening things like coronavirus. And that fear that arises from that leads to a great deal of distrust of formerly lauded and respected scientific and technical elites who have always derived their legitimacy from their supposed ability to take care of things, to take care of us, to protect us from the dangers of the world. This decline in faith in sources of knowledge, in the epistemic status of science, has deepened social divides, and it has increased our tendency to fall back into our tribes and to protect ourselves from the scary world around us. We call this kind of a splintering of epistemic authority. People turn away from science and turn to other sources of knowledge for protection from the uncertainty that they fear. And it causes a retreat to kind of defensive, narrow identities. You fall back to your tribe in order to protect yourself from this scary world. So I think that these are enormous challenges, and because of this just to conclude, this uncertainty and the decline of trust in our technical elites and in the institutions of science creates opportunities for very powerful ideological commitments that people might have anyway to dominate conversations. For instance, commitments to moral impulses that anthropologists like Jonathan Haidt have identified, commitments to freedom and liberty, commitments to loyalty to the group, commitments to purity and the sacredness of social practices. These things become much more powerful in the absence of trust in other sources of knowledge and other sources of ideas about how we should make decisions and how we should govern our societies. Produces openings for conspiracy theories such as QAnon, and makes it very difficult to arrive at considered judgments democratically about issues such as wearing masks in our societies in response to the coronavirus crisis. So what do we do? Just to perhaps lead into our conversation and Q&A, I think that within our societies, it's vitally important that we have a conversation about science education, what science is, and try to bring the general public to a more sophisticated understanding of scientific processes along the line Ivan was suggesting. A better understanding of the nature of complexity, the inevitability of uncertainty, and the processes of scientific judgment that we have to use to see through that uncertainty as we try to deal with the very complex challenges that humanity faces now. Thanks, Christy.
Thank you, Ted. Okay, and now we have a few minutes, about 25 minutes for questions and answers. And I think that the one that I'll start off with is one that has just come up from one of the members of the audience. And that's really about the balance between individual responsibility and institutional responsibility in dealing with these complex challenges. So is it only the government and scientists that we can depend on to help us chart a pathway out of these crises, or should we look to others? And what is the role of ourselves in dealing with wicked problems? So I'm going to first direct this one to Diane.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the things I often say about complex challenges is that everybody is involved. And so you can't, in complicated, you can depend on your leadership to make decisions. But in complex, where self-organization and emergence are key variables, it becomes really important that everybody understands they have a role to play. Each individual in the system has to act in ways that move us towards the emergent outcome that we want to have, not the one that we think we're going to have or somebody else wants us to have. So I would argue that absolutely, as we shift from complicated to complex, and many aspects of COVID, of course, are complex, we need to be recognizing our role. I'll just go also back quickly to that comment about heterogeneity. Each of us has very different personal circumstances, and when you try to tell people, yes, something like wearing masks, you can tell people we've got enough evidence to do that. But when it comes to how do we support people economically. Each person's situation is different, and we need systems that support that.
Great, thank you. Ivan, I'd also like to hear your thoughts on this question, and I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is really around, you know, as consumers, you know, what your expectations are for the consumers of media around complex issues like climate change, and where we might see some signposts for the kinds of advances that you hinted at the end of your submission.
Sure. I mean, I think there's an assumption, I think a reasonable assumption, that consumers of news are looking for something that they can base their decisions on. That they're looking for clarity, in fact, about you know, what am I being told about the world, and how should, you know, and if it's in relation to something like health and well-being or economic interest, how should I act accordingly? So it's a tricky balance for journalists and for scientists too, who are speaking to the media. Of course, scientists are most comfortable speaking in their specialty and trying not to you know, venture too far outside of that. So often it's up to the journalists to try to put together a range of views to kind of reflect a broader picture. But then the challenge becomes, you know, not to oversimplify or leave out some details that might be crucial in that matter. The other challenge, of course, is the assumption, if you're presenting information into the public in some way, is that you're speaking to people just like you, with the interests that you have or the background that you have. So, you know, we're all learning, of course, now more than ever, about, you know, taking diversity into account and diverse experiences into account, so that you know, we're kind of fostering some kind of common ground where people at least are getting a sense of, this is how we know what we know, this is what we can say, this is what we can't say, this is what we need to know next, so that there's at least that kind of common ground, which is, I think, what journalists can bring to the table. So it's that challenge between providing the clarity without papering over, you know, the missing pieces or the complexities that matter.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and you know, I guess the counterpoint to one of the things that you've said is that people are gauging the information that they're looking at, and this came up also in one of the questions from the audience, which is really around you know, this, what has been called this post-truth society that we are currently living in, or at least up until the beginning of this year, and the increasing anti-science sentiment that you're seeing among some groups, as well as potentially a decreasing scientific literacy. So the one of the questions that another person has posed is, how do we increase trust in science and evidence and those that help share this information with us in the face of fear of what we're all going through? And so, Tad, maybe you can talk a little bit about this.
Sure, Christy. So it's an enormous challenge, and I think the four of us have indicated just the scope of that challenge. Diversity of approaches to knowledge and diversity of approaches to solving our complex challenges, such as the pandemic, can be very valuable. But ultimately, what people want is to be told what the answers are. Get this problem off my checklist, so I can get on with running my life and get back to the things I have to do on a day-to-day basis. We're asking people to not just shift their understanding of science, but actually to take on board, as Diane was suggesting, a lot more work in becoming participants in the advancing understanding of our world. So instead of just accepting what they're being told by experts, but to actually participate in the gathering of information, the sifting of judgment, sifting of that information and arrival at judgments, and in a sense to become kind of amateur scientists themselves in reaching conclusions about, for instance, whether they should wear a mask or not, or how serious the climate change problem is. And that's an enormous burden to put on people's shoulders, and to become participants and contributors, in a sense, to the judgment process in our society. And I'm not sure exactly, to be frank, how one creates that capacity. I mean, obviously, a part of it is through our educational systems. There needs to be a more subtle and more sophisticated understanding of science in the general public. The ongoing role of scientific judgment, the limits of science's ability to provide predictive control over complex systems, the inevitability of uncertainty. These things are all things that people need to understand, and that they do have some, in a democracy, some responsibility to actually engage with information and knowledge and try to arrive at decisions. That the trust, in a sense, has to go both ways. That it's not just a matter of sort of passive trust from citizens towards scientists and the scientific enterprise, but the scientists and the scientific enterprise also have to trust citizens to participate in understanding the complex systems around us and what we need to do in response to the challenges that arise from those complex systems. I don't think we have a clear sense for how this is going to work. And because we don't, we're getting this fragmentation of epistemic authority that I was talking about. And people are running off and turning to other sources of knowledge, which they think ultimately will give them the simple answers, the straightforward answers they need. It's an enormous difficulty that we face. And it's not entirely clear what the answers and responses should be at this point.
Great. Thanks, Tad. Mark, I feel like you, perhaps more than any of us, have dealt with some of these vested interests and these so-called, tribes of different groups, and in forging a path for a different way to think about climate change and the responses to it. And I wonder if you can suggest any lessons that you can take from that experience to be applied to other complex problems like the one we're dealing with in COVID-19?
Well, one of the things I think I've learned in the work that we've been doing, my background was in finance for 20, 30 years, is to think about where power lies to influence outcomes or decisions. And we have this sort of historical, and it's framed really in an earlier question, it's between institutions and then individuals. If we can break that down a little, we have power concentrated through government, through voting systems where we have them, through the judicial system, even the media, we have power within the media. And individuals are always constantly trying to get their voice heard through different avenues. Of power is the business world. And if you ask government, where does finance fit? Some governments say, oh yeah, well, finance is part of the business world. And yes, it is, but also it's distinctly different. You've got finance being more powerful in terms of its ability to control and deploy capital, more powerful than corporations and more powerful than governments. And yet that whole system of finance is dependent upon individuals. And so the thing I've seen in the last five years, particularly around the climate challenge, is how individuals expressing a voice, and you see this through the Canadian pension scheme as well as around the world, individuals expressing a voice that flows its way all the way up to the top. And then you've got very large institutions controlling hundreds of billions, then expressing that voice to the business world and also to the political world. And it actually creates political space when investors move in against corporations, particularly, for example, the fossil fuel industry. And those not familiar with Climate Action 100, it's a $46 trillion coalition created just within 2 years. Just to say the number again, $46 trillion coalition created within 2 years to bring the power of capital to challenge companies about pollution. So how does this translate to the crisis we've seen with COVID? It's a difficult translation, but it's one again about individuals trying to express a voice and to be heard. And we should think of different ways in which individuals can be heard. We don't have to rely on the, well, we voted them in, we voted them out. We can express power and influence in different ways. And the financial markets has been one that I've seen that's been transformational in terms of its influence in the climate debate.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think the other element of what you're saying also, perhaps hidden within there is that you do have a background in finance, and so that is something that you probably have been able to draw on in speaking to that community and understanding where they're coming from, and I think I'm glad that you mentioned power, because with science and an authority and expertise comes power, and with capital comes power, and that's something that we haven't spoken very much about today. But I'm glad to hear you talking about some of the innovative responses that you're seeing on the climate front in dealing with what needs to be done and how to lever change in that environment. And so perhaps I'll use that as a jumping off point to ask the other panelists what kinds of innovative responses they are seeing in their own work in dealing with uncertainty, and how we're adapting to the current crisis. So let's go back to Diane to start. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I wasn't expecting that question to come my way, so I was. It's a tough one, and when I was listening to your question and also listening to Mark, I agree with the notion about power as a critical component, understanding where you have those levers of power. And while I want to kind of focus on collective action because we all need to be involved, what we need to understand is when our collective action is important. So our collective action is important in things like wearing masks. Okay, even if the evidence is still a little bit uncertain, the more people that wear masks, the more we change people's perception of the value of wearing masks. Early on in the pandemic in Richmond, BC, which has a big Asian population, they all wore masks because it's the culture, the deeply held belief that that's fine, that's okay. And that drove pretty low rates in Richmond early in the pandemic. I've been super disappointed when I go into stores and I still see people not wearing masks, although back in the city today, I see it's getting a little bit better. So here's the challenge. Do we mandate it and then you get reactions? Do we suggest this is important and then by our leaders, by the people with some power? There's a big tension there, and there's where context also matters a lot. So in some places, clearly the reaction to that kind of an approach is quite negative, whereas in BC, it's pretty good. And so, and it's a judgment call, and there is no clear, this is the best thing to do, although the increasing evidence is sending us in that direction. So I'm not sure I quite answered your question, Christy, but hopefully that was a bit of a starting place, and Tad can jump in.
Thanks. Yes, I'll go on to Tad, but if we do have time, perhaps you can go back. I think you mentioned patient registration system that I'd like to hear more about, but let's move to Tad and then we'll come back to you.
Sure. I think this mask issue is a really interesting case study of all the things we're talking about today. And it really brings to a fine point the kinds of challenges we're facing. So far, as Diane has pointed out, Bonnie Henry has relied very substantially on what you could call moral suasion to try to influence public behavior, and it's been pretty successful. I mean, it's remarkable how BC managed to bring the incidence of COVID down very quickly. But there's evidence now that it's reaching diminishing returns, that people are becoming complacent, and we could have something resembling a Melbourne situation in BC before long. Melbourne thought they'd had it under control, and of course it's just exploded over the last few weeks. So I think the issue then becomes, how you use the science that has developed very quickly in the last week or two on the efficacy of masks and on aerosol transmission, how you use that science, those scientific findings, in a democratic conversation. Do you use it as a foundation or a set of justifications for a mandate, saying, okay, everybody now needs to wear masks because the science is pointing in that direction? Or do you use it again to sort of strengthen the kind of moral suasion? It's a somewhat more complex systems approach that Diane has been emphasizing from the beginning of this panel discussion. And I am increasingly, unfortunately, leaning towards a mandate. I think that people actually need to be told, now's the time to wear masks, folks, because the science is pointing in that direction. But even then, I think you can talk about the science. And I think one of the things that Bonnie Henry has done brilliantly in this province is that she has been very open about the science and its pros and cons, the evolving judgment process. So the trust in that kind of expertise, I think, in general, is much higher in BC than it has been. And I think she could use that as saying, to back a mandate and say, okay, given my sense of the science, which is here it is, and this is the balance of evidence that we have, it's time to put on masks, folks. And that would reflect, I think, the kind of trust that we have managed to develop in BC towards technical and scientific elites that have helped us move through a little bit more positively this COVID crisis.
Thanks, Tad. I was going to say, Ivan, you've probably been dealing quite a bit with the debate on masks in your work, and I think the other thread that I've observed in terms of our public health officer here in British Columbia relates to emotions and emotionality and the empathy that she brings with her authority. And I wonder if those are two threads, maybe, Ivan, that you can speak to, emotions and the debate around masks that you've seen in your work.
You're on mute.
Thanks. Absolutely. And I agree with Tad also that the masks will be an interesting thing to watch and to think about and analyze as time goes on, because it is a case study. And I think not only on its own, but in contrast to other aspects of the pandemic that we're going to see further down the road. So the one thing that we see in the mask case is a strategy that is sometimes deployed when talking about science or scientific evidence, which is the precautionary principle. This idea that maybe we don't have all of the evidence, but we should perhaps take this course of action as a precaution. But it's a double-edged sword. That even can be applied to climate change, for example, or to other areas, where we might not have all the evidence, but the weight of evidence. The double-edged sword comes when it's applied in different ways, perhaps even counterintuitive ways. And I think we're going to see this when it comes time to deploying a vaccine. With masks, the precautionary principle is clear. It doesn't really hurt me to wear a mask. Maybe I'm helping people. But when it comes to the subject of vaccines, where there may be a more complicated public response to who gets a vaccine, and also maybe there's a perception that there are risks on both sides. And then suddenly the precautionary principle depends on how you deploy it. Perhaps people are going to be hesitant about a vaccine, which they view as a precaution, at least until other people have tried it, that sort of thing, which could delay the deployment. So that means the messaging has to be more thoughtful and I think more transparent about why certain decisions are being taken. I mean, it's an interesting conversation. We're having this conversation now about mandatory masks. It'll be interesting to see if there's going to be a conversation about mandatory vaccination and what kind of challenge that may present. And of course, there are other cases where the precautionary principle is not appropriate. A non-ionizing radiation comes up as a kind of occasional thing that pops up in the media, where people are concerned that certain kinds of radio frequencies might cause cancer, and then you'll sort of see a wave of coverage, and maybe there should be no wireless devices in public places. And obviously we haven't gone that route, and experts in the field broadly say this is not something we have to worry about as a health risk as far as we can tell. But it's hard. But what's obvious to experts is hard to turn into a formula for the public, where you say, definitely worry about this, definitely don't worry about this, and then also to, that there's this large gray zone where there's kind of shifting or evolving evidence about what we should be worried about or not, and how those risks are compared to others that are in the environment. Microplastics is a good example. It's hard to know how concerned we should be, at least from the health perspective, about microplastics in the environment. There just isn't enough evidence to really tell us that. I'm sorry, my cat's meowing behind me. So all I want to say there is that one size does not fit all when we're talking about these various policy decisions. And so we're sometimes not that well served, for example, by decision makers who say, we're going to, follow the evidence, or, evidence-based decision making is in the room, unless they unpack that a little bit more. I mean, sometimes evidence-based decision making is kind of floated almost like a feature, just like we have central air or something. We also have, evidence-based decision making in the room. But there are many cases where evidence is ambiguous, and it's not quite clear how it would guide the decision making if there isn't a clear, straightforward answer coming from the data. So that's something that we have to bear in mind. And again, transparency is probably the best answer.
Great. I think Diane wanted to say something, and so Diane, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to you, and maybe you can do two things. And the one is respond as you had planned, and then also lead us off in a final summation on key lessons for us, or a call to action from your perspective.
Oh boy. Okay. So I wanted to respond to a bunch of things that were said. I agree. I think we're long past where I would have hoped Bonnie Henry had said, yes, you have to wear a mask. I think she's trying to do that in her, but many people have stopped listening to her in intimate detail. So the message somehow is not getting through that this is important. And this is where I think people like Ivan become enormously important, when the message might not be getting through. I can think back to the beginning of the pandemic when I saw Andre Picard's piece with the title, "Shut It Down Now," and I shut down and moved my class online before my university even made the decision to move classes online, and was glad to be able to do that. So here's where strong, thoughtful evidence approach to media is incredibly important. One thing that hasn't been said about truth in science is that scientists also have to have more humility, and they need to recognize when a systems approach is more valuable. And some of the systems approaches that have come to the fore recently are things like systems modeling, which help us give us the flatten the curve notion that comes to some extent from modeling. Early in the pandemic, that was super important. Now, actually, what systems science is telling us is that if you have a situation like in Melbourne, you have to shut it totally down for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you can begin reopening. Because once you get rid of COVID in a particular jurisdiction, then people can safely open the economy as long as you have deep tracking and tracing. So it goes from complex back to complicated when you shut it down. So I think that's incredibly important. And well, I could keep going on, but I get the timing is there. So I guess my final call to action is that all of us, scientists, journalists, and members of the public, all have to remember that in complexity, you can't have necessarily best practices. You need to focus on solutions, and maybe focus a little less on the cause of the problem, because I still hear that deeply in almost everybody's remarks, the other panelists' remarks, when, things like microplastics. Do we really need to work out that this is bad for us to have a good sense that maybe we should get them out of our environment because of what it's doing in the oceans and things like that? So, that's just one example of many things where we mire ourselves in the argument about what's the cause, when we need to be talking about how systems framing of this will get us towards solutions more quickly. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Diane. Mark, final comments.
So, with so much data floating around and scientists trying to get attention for their work, what the message I'd leave, and my world is the financial world, is that growing numbers of the financial community that control our pension system and our banking system now believe in the science around climate change and are interested in the data. And the financial system are used to modeling complexity. That's what they do. They're used to creating financial instruments that reflect complexity. And what I'm seeing is in some respects, it's the banking system and regulators. And obviously, we know about the work of Mark Carney with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. People like them and actuaries are coming to this particular battle of dealing with climate change. And they're relying on the data. No one is questioning now the science. They're relying on the data that is given to them. And the reason for that is because they want to act, and they want to act on behalf of the public, who are ultimately are the savers here, and they want to act because they're also interested in a climate secure energy system and a safe landing from the climate challenge that we face. And central to this is a trust in the science and also the trust in the data that the science is telling us to act.
Super. Thank you. Ivan.
I'm going to shamelessly take the last few minutes to make an appeal to support journalism, both from the public to support kind of responsible journalism in the public space, and pay attention to what those sources are, and also an appeal to scientists to be open to being part of that conversation, to answering the phone when a journalist calls, and to recognizing their larger role in that public conversation. I think we can talk about what we can give various prescriptions for what will improve things, or how we'll get a better understanding of reality and get better decisions, but it can't happen unless everyone's talking to everyone, and if people are reading and assessing what they see in the media.
Great, thanks. And Tad, for our final remarks.
Sure, thanks, Christy. I start out my remarks by asking whether it's right to regard science having a privileged epistemic authority. Is it a special way of gaining knowledge about reality? And I don't want to speak for all the panelists, but I think it is. I think it's this institutionalized method of bringing evidence to bear on our hypotheses, so that shift the balance of probability as to whether we perceive those hypotheses to be right or wrong, is a very powerful method for managing in this world. But I think as we move forward, the conception of science needs to be adjusted. And I think we've touched on a lot of the ways that has to happen within in our remarks today. The public needs to have a better understanding of systems and complexity, at least a lay understanding, a kind of back of the envelope understanding of what that means and how to apply it in the world. Also, the public needs to have a better understanding for how science works, the ongoing process of judgment it involves. Scientists, on their hand, as was just mentioned, need to exhibit more humility about the nature and the value of the knowledge, especially when it comes to dealing with managing complex systems, the value of the knowledge that they provide. And I think on both sides, there needs to be a reinvigoration of trust as much as possible between the communities, trust of the scientific enterprise from the citizens towards trusting in the scientific enterprise and scientists themselves through this new conception of science, or adjusted conception of science, so they understand it better, and so they have more trust for the enterprise. And then on the other hand, I think for scientists themselves, willingness to trust the general public as being partners or participants in using scientific knowledge to arrive at judgments about how we should manage in this world. And I think that's a co-evolutionary process. co-production process for trust. It's not just from citizens towards scientists, but also from scientists towards citizens, and of building a new understanding of science in the process on both sides.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this exciting and stimulating conversation. So it is my pleasure to close this webinar. So I'm Adel Gitouni. I am the Associate Co-Chair of the Victoria Forum. So today, sorry, I'm trying to get my slides. So thank you very much for to our panelists. The video for the recording from this webinar will be made available soon, so we'll be sent it around, and please disseminate to your network. Thanks to Christy and Thomas for leading and being the champions on putting together this amazing conversation. Also, we thank our partners for the webinar, PIX and Cascadia. The next one, and this will be a good kind of continuation to this conversation, we will have a conversation about this great reset with the participation from the IMF, the World Bank, the Senate, and the Bank of Canada. And thanks to Dr. Majerby and Dr. C for putting this webinar together. So please reserve the date and manage to be there, because it will continue and build in this on this conversation that we had today. And several times you heard people talking about the importance of the financial sector and how and the power of changing and moving things. The ones after that are about trust in globalization. So that is another very interesting collaboration that we have between the Victoria Forum and the Association of Economists in the Mediterranean, and bringing a perspective from Europe, from Asia, and Canada. And the one after that is about the future of doing business and banking. So, and we will continue this series every 2 weeks after that. Please also pencil on your calendar the Virtual Victoria Forum. It's going to be on October 12th to 14th. And the idea is we would like to draft a number of recommendations and solutions for different stakeholders. So it's not only just for the public policy maker, but also for businesses and decision makers. There will be more announcement coming your way about the Virtual Victoria Forum. All of these events are co-hosted by the University of Victoria and the Senate of Canada. And we are really honored by this partnership and supported by Thales and Van City. So I would like to finish by the call to action, and I captured at least one, but I think I would like to add to that is supporting the journalism and also embracing complexity. I think those are the two other call to action. So we would like to encourage innovative science education and try to comprehend this complexity of systems, and especially their dynamics. On vous encourage à développer une éducation scientifique innovante pour essayer de mieux comprendre la complexité des systèmes et leur dynamique. And on this, I look forward to seeing you all during the next webinar in 2 weeks. Thank you.